Today's lecture is on sacrifice. There are 4 words that are used for sacrifice in the Old Testament. First Hebrew word is the word korban, which means dedicated to God or an offering. It literally means something that is being brought near. Sometimes it's translated oblation. It's used 80 times in the Old Testament, but only in Leviticus, Numbers, and Ezekiel, chapter 20, verse 28, and chapter 40, verse 43. It involves a kind of ritualistic idea, and it's a somewhat legalistic term. The first thing the offerer was responsible to do when he brought his korban was to make sure that his choice reflected his own self-sacrifice. So it must be from his own efforts, that is, his own produce. The offerer was showing his own love and consecration to God so he could present the best that he had. The second thing was that the one bringing the offering would place his hand on the head, which indicated his intention to give himself to God. If it was a sin offering, he was saying, I deserve to die because of my sin. The animal then died vicariously in his place. It is always to be presented in the presence of God at the temple, which was built in a specified place of God's own choosing. These offerings did not make the God of Israel any more valuable. This was a concept of idolatry. The idol becomes more valuable when offerings are sacrificed to it. Offerings to God only show him honor. Making offerings to God demands one's allegiance and loyalty. But once the person loses sight of the purposes of the sacrifice loses its efficacy. The number of sacrifices has no relevance, and making more sacrifices cannot make up for a lack of faith. The second term that is used is a compound term, matanot kodesh. This means gifts of holiness. A matanot is a gift of any kind, and it can even be used for a bribe, but kodesh makes it holy. These are gifts that are separated to God. The third word is mincha. This is a gift of grain, a grain offering. It's used in the secular context, indicating an offering to be given to a superior person, expressing submission. This was always part of the olah, which is the whole burnt offering. It was holy, it was only eaten by the priests, and it was not to be shared with the people. The fourth word is olah. The whole burnt offering comes from the verb Allah, which means to go up, and so it means to offer up. And then the final word, there are 5, I said there were 4, but there are actually 5, is zebah, which is used in connection with any of the sacrifices. It's a general word meaning offering. So what made the sacrifice different from other gifts to the Lord was that all or part of the sacrifice came in contact with the altar. There's a difference, of course, between this and the temple tax that was required of every male. Without the altar, there would be no sacrifice. Coming in contact with the altar meant the consumption of the sacrifice was the work of Yahweh. King Ahaz did this concept great violence by shifting the altar, the bronze altar, off to the side in the temple and replacing it with one that he copied from Damascus, which would obviously have been an altar that was used in idol worship. The tabernacle was not considered as a place for God to abide, but so that the people would understand that God did stand in the midst of them. When a sacrifice was offered, God took possession of the sacrifice. It was not just to bring satisfaction, but it involves satisfaction in that it represents the realization of God's purposes in bringing Israel out of Egypt into relationship with himself. God's purpose in the sacrifice was that the people would be constantly presenting themselves before God. God takes pleasure in such presentation. Israel, because they present themselves to God, become capable of receiving the blessings God wants to give them. God finds pleasure in being able to bless them. So worship in Israel is not only Godward, but it involves Israel receiving from God. The blessing of God is to be present and evident in every aspect of life. To the sacrifice of the people, there is the response of God, by which he brings them not the desired blessing, but the promised blessing. Presenting oneself to God in the sacrifice involves surrender to God's purposes, being completely committed to God, to whatever God decides to do with you. The blessing is to have God's sovereign will performed in the life of the offerer. The reason Israel was sent into exile was that they wanted to find God's blessing. Their sacrifices were ritualistic and mechanical. They wanted to state what God should do to bless them, rather than living in submission and relationship with him and receiving the blessings that he poured out. The requirements for the sacrifice. First of all things given to God must be clean, including the offerer. It's unacceptable to offer a sacrifice when you are not clean before him. Malachi complains about this, the requirement for ceremonial cleanness. Secondly, the sacrifice must be taken from what constitutes the sustenance or life of the offerer. Sacrifice is to be seen as presenting life to God. Even the grain or meal offering presented the life of the offerer. God is not interested in anything short of life. He desires to have us understand our need of life from him. There were two classifications of sacrifices, obviously. There were the national sacrifices that were required daily, and then special ones in the month and new moons and things like that. Okay, but there was also individual sacrifices. So the individual sacrifices involve, first of all, the burnt offering, which is mentioned in Leviticus chapter 1. It was completely burned, and it's the only one that was. Okay, it spoke of entire consecration of the individual who brought it. The second one is the meal offering. This is mentioned in Leviticus chapter 2. Part of it was burned, and the rest was for the officiating priest, sometimes connected with the burnt offering. It recognized the blessing of God on the land. The land produced the grain, but it also recognized that they came to live in the land because of God's grace. The third kind of individual offering is a peace offering. This is mentioned in Leviticus 3, sometimes called a fellowship offering. It's an expression of gratitude to God and desire to have fellowship with him. It was completely voluntary, and it involved the worshipper bringing the sacrifice and presenting to the priest, and then the parts of the animal that had to be burned were burned. The rest of the animal was cooked, and there was a fellowship meal with the family of the offerer and with the priests and in the presence of God in the tabernacle. The final offering was the guilt or sin offering. These are mentioned in Leviticus 4 and 5. The sin offering involved a trespass against God, whereas the guilt offering involved a trespass against another person. Okay. However, outright rebellion against God and refusal to do what God requires, for that there was no sacrifice and therefore no forgiveness. The forgiveness that is offered in these sacrifices is for sins of ignorance. Okay, the national offerings. Numbers 28 and 29 speak of the Feast of Tabernacles. But every day there was a morning and evening burnt offering. The whole burnt offering represented the complete consecration of the offerer. The different offerings represented different motives for presenting an offering. The priest was, in the morning and evening burnt offering, making an offering on behalf of the whole nation. But the national offering did not substitute for the individual burnt offering. Even if everyone had been present at the national offering, it would not substitute for the individual offering. So the daily offerings were continual offerings, morning and evening sacrifices. But on the Sabbath, there were extra offerings, and on the new moon, at the monthly offerings, also the Passover offerings were in addition to the daily offerings. And first fruits, the specific offerings there, were in addition to the daily offerings. So Consecration was symbolized by the whole burnt offering is to be continually renewed. And for us, our living sacrifice is to be continual. This daily sacrifice was basic to all the other sacrifices. If it was not made daily, then there was no point in making the other sacrifices of the new moon, the Sabbath feasts, and etc. Continual consecration is not an option, it's a command. Note Job, for example. Job always offered sacrifices on behalf of his children, just in case they had inadvertently lost their consecration. Note in the New Testament, every time Jesus speaks about his death, the disciples argue about who is greatest, because they realized they would need a leader once he was gone. They did not understand the servant leader role. This is aiming at the idea, again, of total consecration, which is supposed to be the basis of all life in Israel. It carries through into the New Testament. In Luke chapter 9, verse 23, we're told to take up our cross daily. Without our own personal cross, total consecration, well, nothing else counts. The cross is not for carrying, it's for dying on. So we have to deny ourselves daily, die to self, and every day consecrate ourselves afresh to God totally. Secondly, there were new moon offerings. Numbers 28, verses 11 to 15 mention these. They began each month, and they indicated that each month the needed blessing from God was required upon their lives. Last month was not enough for this month. What was due each month was also due each week. So there were Sabbath offerings. That's the third kind of offering, mentioned in Numbers 28, verses 9 and 10. These were national, and they were made only in the temple. But at each home, the Sabbath rest was required. The Sabbath was celebrated in every home, but the sacrifice was made only in the temple. In each home, the father acted as a priest for the Sabbath celebration. Fourthly, we have the Day of Atonement. In Numbers chapter 29, verses 7 to 11. It was the only day in the law similar to fasting. All the others were called feasts, but on the Day of Atonement there was fasting. 2 animals were presented. One was killed, and the other one was set free. The one that was set free was called the scapegoat, and it was typological of all the sins of Israel being taken away. God did not require all males to be present on this day. The feast began when the priest came out and they knew their sins were forgiven. So up until that point they fasted. Then when the priest announced that their sins were forgiven, then they feasted. Fifthly, we have the Feast of Tabernacles in Numbers 29, verses 12 to 40. Each day required a certain number of sacrifices, and the offering was reduced by 1 bull each day, and the final day of the feast required only 1 bull, and half the number of lambs of the previous day. So the last day was the greatest day, but involved the least number of sacrifices. This was to emphasize the activities of celebration. So by the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, the altar must have been a very messy place. So the annual cycle in Israel, in the first month were the latter rains, and then there was Passover on the 14th day, and it was followed by 7 days of unleavened bread. All Israelite males were required to present themselves to the Lord at the temple for these feasts. In the third month was the Feast of Weeks. It was a celebration of harvest completion. It was the same as Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, and it celebrated the giving of the law at Sinai. Again, all Israelite males were required to present themselves to the Lord for this feast. In the 7th month, the civil year began, and it was announced by the Feast of Trumpets, announced the first day of the new civil year. In the 8th month, on the 10th day of the month, was the Day of Atonement, and then starting on the 15th day was the Feast of Tabernacles. Tabernacles involved looking back over the blessing of the Lord over the last year, and the year had really been concluded on the Day of Atonement. In the 11th month, this is when the former rains began, and in modern Israel and in post-Maccabean Israel, This includes the Feast of Lights, which is called Hanukkah. It celebrated the ruling of the Maccabees and the deliverance from Antiochus Epiphanes. It celebrated the fact that there was a miraculous provision of oil in the temple for the light in the temple, for the lampstand to keep burning when there was no way to provide it with light, that there was a miraculous provision of that oil. And then in the 12th month is the Feast of Purim, which of course celebrates the deliverance from Haman during the Persian period. The third feast that males were required to present themselves to the Lord at the temple for was the Feast of Tabernacles. I omitted to mention that earlier. So this was the yearly cycle for Israel. The final day of the Feast of Tabernacles was the high point of the year. Many believe that on this day the king was brought into Jerusalem and declared again to be God's representative on the throne. God is understood to be always present, but on this day they made a renewal of their commitment to God, looking back over their blessings of the past year with gratitude, looking forward to future blessings. But at the same time they remembered the wilderness wanderings by living in tabernacles. Psalm 21 seems to refer to the Feast of Trumpets. Psalm 22, of course, prefigures Calvary. But when David wrote it, he was having a personal struggle and felt God had forsaken him. It seems to have been read on the Day of Atonement, as the priest comes out of the holy place with a declaration of forgiveness, seen in verses 22 following. This leads to worship. Psalm 23 begins the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 5 is a renewal of the covenant, eating and drinking in God's presence in the midst of hostile nations who don't understand. In verse 6, I will dwell. Translate the verb, which could come from either yashav in Hebrew, which means to dwell, or shuv, to return. And it seems David is committed to returning to the Lord's house regularly. Psalms 24 celebrates the final day of the Feast of Tabernacles, when God is announced to be king, as the king of the land returns to be reconsecrated and accepted as God's representative. This shows us that it's kind of important to keep the Psalms in order and read them in the context of the events they celebrate. So just a final note on this whole period of the Exodus period. The Lord did not make the Israelites better. The covenant was not added to by the law, but the law made it clear for them how they could continue to be in covenant relationship with God. All the feasts and sacrifices were a part of the covenant blessing becoming a reality. Therefore, the worship would not be acceptable if it did not satisfy the standards. So a couple of other things we should say about all of these feasts and sacrifices. They were designed in a way to include the entire family. At Passover, the youngest child who was able to speak asked the father questions, set questions about why is this night different from all other nights, and so that the father can retell the story of the Exodus. During the Feast of Unleavened Bread, mothers would hide cakes or pieces of bread in the house with leaven in, and the children would have like a treasure hunt, hide and seek, find the pieces of leaven so that they could be cleaned out of the house. Tabernacles was like a camping holiday. They built tabernacles either on the roofs of the houses or out in the fields where they were finishing the harvest, and they lived in them for a week. And it was a time of great celebration and included the whole family. And so we see that these feasts were not just rituals or rules that had to be obeyed, but they were supposed to be times of celebration for God's goodness, times when the whole family was included, when testimonies were given, when the young children in the family learned the wonderful things that God had done for the whole family, and remind us that God lived in their midst. And so they were cause for great rejoicing, and they are celebrated with great enthusiasm.